Hi, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be on, and I really appreciate so much the invitation to be here. I won't repeat my own introduction on top of that, but I'll just say I'm joining you today from a somewhat rainy afternoon in my home in Atlanta, Georgia, and it's a real pleasure, as I said, to be on to represent the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, which, for those who may not know, is a nonpartisan research and policy organization based in Washington, D.C. We focus primarily on state and federal policies that are fiscally responsible and that work to advance opportunity and to reduce poverty. And so, with that, I think I will jump into my slides. And I know I'm still just seeing my introductions. Okay, there we go. Perfect. Um, all right. So, what I'm going to do today is really just spend, I think, about 20 minutes trying to give people a real general sense of the lay of the land of where our nation stands in terms of kind of key economic, workforce, and policy considerations in the wake of COVID-19. And I'm going to close with a little bit of just quick perspective on kind of where we might go from here. And so to go to the next slide, um, this is just again a quick little overview of what I'm going to be covering, which is a bit of a play in three acts, if you will. I'm going to spend some time unpacking really the severe and in many cases disparate impact, as the state senator was referring to earlier, on sort of different communities across our country. Also spend some time talking about the lingering economic hardship from the crisis, which despite economic improvement and improvement in many areas is lingering for lots of families and communities. And then I'm going to close with just a little bit about how, even after this sort of grim year and in this still somewhat grim moment, there is really a historic chance, and one could argue opportunity, to mitigate a lot of the harm that we saw, especially economically, and then to invest in a stronger, more equitable economy long term. So to tell that story, starting with the next slide, I do like to start at the top with a little bit of kind of grounding and an acknowledgement when I give these sorts of presentations, which is just to say that, when COVID-19 arrived on our shores in February of 2020, I mean, it really did usher in about a year and a half now, right, of, just turmoil in a lot of ways, socially, economically, and of course, in terms of people's individual health. The economic crisis that followed was really deeply damaging. But again, I'm always remiss not to at least start with just acknowledging the extreme levels of just human toll and in many cases suffering, for many more than others, but a crisis that really sort of probably touched all of us, at least in one way or another. And so to start the story there, but then to go now to what followed that immediate health impact, is really that intense sort of economic ripple effect that we saw after the pandemic's arrival. We know that once the onset of the virus arrived, um, due to the demands of responding to the public health emergency in various sorts of ways, we started to see widespread business closings right away. Uh, Many of which, unfortunately, especially for small businesses, became permanent in a lot of areas. Massive layoffs and furloughs, both in the private and public sector, and other sorts of widespread after effects. So these were things like families either losing their income entirely or losing a good chunk of their income and struggling to afford basics like rent and food and other necessities, as well as just more general ability to have money for consumer spending. So as the next slide highlights, we saw this crisis really descend in an intense way right away. This was kind of, beginning in mid to late March. We started to see these sorts of economic headlines and sort of policy report headlines, which is someone whose job it is to consume a lot of policy and economic information and read a lot of reports, so on and so forth. I really hope I don't see it again anytime soon, or for that matter, see again in my career. I've always been struck in particular by the word breathtaking to be used to describe the spike in unemployment insurance we saw after COVID-19 arrived, because breathtaking is thankfully a word we don't have to use a lot when it comes to policymaking, and I hope I don't have to use too often here in the future either. The next slide goes to another level of detail on this, showing that at the end of March of 2020, we had seen initial UI claims nationwide skyrocket from essentially a couple 100,000 a week to more than 6 million for a couple of weeks there, late March, first part of April. And those levels of unemployment insurance claims stayed above a million essentially throughout the summer, a million a week, I should say. The next slide highlights how that sort of intense shock to the labor market, to the economy, wasn't just confined to the private sector. Due to the shutdown of sort of normal state and local activities, as well as widespread expectations of pending kind of fiscal doom, we saw enormous public sector furloughs and layoffs in the immediate wake of the crisis. This was especially true at the local level, and especially true in K through 12 education. So in last April and May, the public sector had about 1.5 million furloughs and layoffs in just those 2 months. That was roughly 2 times the amount of layoffs and furloughs in the public sector, in the state and local public sector, in the immediate aftermath of the Great Recession. And that layoff number remains very elevated. I believe it's now 1.3 million fewer state and local public sector workers than before the pandemic. The next slide just kind of quickly highlights how that early wave of layoffs was felt in communities large and small across the country. There are any number of examples I could highlight of some places where entire bus fleets, sort of bus driver fleets, or educational support staff were, sent home for a period of time on the educational front, sort of sent home months earlier than they would have otherwise been for the summer. And some of those jobs never came back. We also see things like fire departments, park services, any number of things having sort of unprecedented cuts to their workforces in a kind of emergency effort to cut those costs, again, in the immediate wake of the pandemic's arrival. Speaking of cutting cost, it's also true that in these early days, as the next slide will show, many states began moving to impose pretty huge budget cuts to things like education, health services, even, as well as a range of other services. I should note here, and I'm going to come back to this later, and I believe there's a whole nother panel at one point to kind of focus more on fiscal issues, so I won't belabor it. But in many cases, some of these cuts have been backfilled because of improving revenues, or at least mitigated. But in other cases, they have not. And some of those cuts to vital services remain in place. Even in cases where they don't remain in place, that initial wave of state and local budget cutting did impose some additional short-term harm on families and communities reliant on those services. So the next slide just will quickly illustrate how the combo of those things, kind of led to a situation for our economy and for our workers and families out there that we'll all remember. People lined up at UI offices, sort of like cars wrapped for, in some cases, miles in front of food banks, and people struggling to afford other basics, so rent, utilities, any number of things. So that is kind of Act One, if you will, as I alluded to earlier, of a bit of a 3-act overview. The second act is kind of what happened next, and then where we stand now on this economic and workforce front. The place to start there, I think, is kind of a clear recognition that the raft of federal action approved in March of 2020, again, early in the crisis by bipartisan majorities in Congress and signed into law by President Trump, really did offer a sizable, impactful kind of lifeline to individual workers, families, and broader communities and states. I've listed many of those provisions here, so I won't read them off. But there was a sizable amount of that initial relief that kind of blunted in some ways, the worst of the economic impact and allowed things to get moving into the next phase. Now, that wave of relief, as well as kind of the gradual reopening we saw on the state and local level, as highlighted on the next slide, sort of helped the economy start returning to life over the latter course of 2020. And it also contributed to sort of something else interesting happening, which is that in part because people were getting economically stabilized and were able to kind of be out there and continue to spend, in some cases in person, but also online, as well as some idiosyncratic factors related to state tax systems, is that state and local revenues wound up coming in kind of better than many of the initial worst, most dire projections had really thought that they might. And so this ability for states and localities to sort of not have that as intense of a budgetary impact as initially expected kind of limited, again, over the latter course of 2020 into 2021, sort of additional harm being layered on the fiscal side. And then it's also true that over time, the Herculean efforts we saw from health officials, essential workers, and scientists kind of leads to what we see on the next slide, which is that we were able to kind of, again, eventually get the virus under control. Obviously, it's still out there in some communities more than others, but it has allowed a bit more of a full-fledged return to social and economic normalcy that we've really, seen continue to pick up over recent months. So with those improvements from the depth of that sort of 2021 initial round of despair, it might mean that we're, at first glance, getting close to completely back to normal, right? But as I sort of lift up on the next slide, that, is of course not true. There's going to be lingering effects and impacts of a crisis of that size. And I want to highlight kind of two of them in particular. One is that levels of hardship for many families remain high, and particularly high in some communities more than others, which is kind of the second point I'm going to delve into a little bit. What this slide is showing, and I think this is a good sort of clear overarching stat to think about this point, is that essentially right now, which is to say the end of May, beginning of June is when we have this data for, 1 in 4 adults nationwide were reporting that they had trouble paying for their usual household expenses in the last 7 days. And that's a number that is particularly high in many communities of color, especially amongst African Americans, is highlighted in this slide, as well as other groups. And I want to make a quick note here that the reason we have this kind of clear sense of the real-time status of how families are doing out there is that after the COVID emergency arrived, the Census Bureau kind of rolled out a new survey, if you will, a new package of data called the Pulse Household Survey that allows us to have as close as really we've ever had to a real-time sense of how people are doing out there in terms of things like economic well-being. Do they have enough to eat? Do they have a roof over their head, et cetera? That is a good pivot to the next slide, where I show, or where we can see, I should say, that level of persistent, we see that level of kind of persistent hardship come up in a couple of particular ways. One is families' ability to be able to afford their rent. One thing we're seeing in the data is there are now 1 in 5 renters living with children who are still not caught up on rent. Another way we see it is with families' ability to just have enough food on the table. Data are showing that for 1 in 8 adults with children, the households are reporting that they lack sufficient food in the last 7 days. And again, these data are as recent as we can get, which is last week of May, first week of June. The next slide will kind of lift up a little bit the second aspect of the point that I was alluding to earlier, which is that these disparities do vary a bit across communities, across disproportionately, across various demographic groups. So on the issue of food hardship, for example, as we're seeing here, we see that the levels of reported food hardship were both higher in Black and Latino communities than they were in white and Asian communities before the crisis in the orange, which is say 2019. And then they skyrocketed to much higher levels in the depth of the COVID-19 emergency. That's December 2020 is that data. But we see they're still elevated in the darkest blue with that lingering hardship that we're seeing now. So what explains the kind of high level of lingering hardship as well as that disparate impact? First, it's got to be noted that while some states, as alluded to earlier, have seen much more of an improvement than others, nationwide, we're still seeing a significant jobs deficit of nearly 8 million jobs nationwide, below where we were when the crisis hit. The next slide will illustrate how that actually understates the jobs deficit nationwide a bit, because the economy had actually been growing at a pretty decent clip when COVID-19 began. And had the emergency not happened, we would have at that prior pace would have had about 3 million more jobs now, as opposed to those 8 million fewer jobs. The next slide will also show that at the same time, in addition to having a shortfall, the jobs recovery has been a bit unequal, especially in the early days of the crisis. So by August, or I guess by September, this slide goes through of last year, high wage jobs by that point had essentially already recovered from that initial downfall, whereas lower wage ones were still way down, and this trend has continued on into this year. The next slide just puts a finer point on this by showing that even with the most recent data we have up until May 2021, the losses are still concentrated nationwide in those lower wage and to a lesser extent medium wage industries versus the high wage industries that are either back to normal or just a little bit still down. On the next slide, we will see that in addition to that sort of wage or income disparity, we also saw the losses being most concentrated among groups with fewer years of education, with folks having a college degree or higher, most able to weather that storm of the job losses. One reason for this I would quickly highlight on the kind of wage and industry front is simply the concentration of people with with fewer years of schooling in various sorts of service industries, for example, leisure and hospitality, that were really slammed by the initial waves of economic disruption. So a few more points here in my time. On this slide, I think does a really interesting job of highlighting that in addition to those income and educational disparities I just referenced, we also saw the crisis have a really disproportionate impact on communities of color. On this slide, I know there's a lot going on, but I would highlight sort of in each of the categories, there's the kind of dark gray band that shows that overall job losses were higher in each of those three communities of color. And then there's an additional point here that also in many ways applies to women more generally, about women in those communities also bearing an additional brunt of the impact. Some reasons for that are concentrations in kind of frontline and essential service industries, as well as the outsized caregiving responsibilities. Evidence strongly indicates, as well as common sense, I would say, that women bore during the crisis and during the needs that arose. So the next slide will just sort of highlight quickly that disparate racial and ethnic impact that we saw from COVID-19 is, of course, nothing new, but is something that rather was sort of exposed and exacerbated longstanding existing inequities in the labor market. And this is just showing that the share of those communities, these different communities in the prime age population with a job was already had an inequity before the crisis that was worsened over the recent span. So that brings me quickly to my last section, which is just a little bit about where we go from here in terms of thinking about the next steps. And what I want to kind of emphasize going to the next slide is that while the first couple of parts of my story, may have been a bit on the, if not depressing side, sort of the stern side of here's the intensity of the impact that we saw out there. The reality is that states and localities also really are poised at this historic moment to do a lot of good in terms of their policy making. The reason for that, just to kind of quickly tick through these, is as the Lieutenant Governor alluded to earlier, the economy sort of has been on a steady, if uneven nationwide recovery in many places, and that even though that lingering hardship is still out there, as I was detailing, many states and localities also have that improved fiscal position than they thought they were going to be in the earlier days of the crisis, although there are challenges that remain, such as increased cost for a variety of things. And then we've had the recent American Rescue Plan, which kind of offers, for a variety of reasons, a historic chance to mitigate harm and invest in the future on the state and local level. And then states and localities, of course, have additional tools that they can use to invest in sort of moving into the next phase. So just to close out with a few quick points, one is just kind of giving a little bit of detail here on what we saw with, honestly, a really far-reaching approach from the American Rescue Plan that was enacted in March. This is something that has managed to sort of further stabilize many families' own economic balance sheets. And as sort of noted at the end there, has given states and localities a historic amount of flexible aid to further pursue their own responses to the crisis. A bit more detail on the flexible funds piece of that is that the American Rescue Plan has provided to states, localities, tribes, and territories, as many of you, or if not, I'm sure perhaps probably all of you on this call know, $350 billion in flexible funds. These are meant to be used for a few relatively specific but also broad categories of responding to the kind of health and as well as economic effects of the pandemic, the types of things that I was talking about. But at the same time, the Treasury has provided states and other governments a lot of flexibility in terms of the specific ways they'll be able to use these dollars. And that sort of brings up the question of kind of what to spend those dollars on. And I sort of don't have the time, and I'm not going to be sort of detailing you with our specific recommendations, but I just want to leave you with a couple of thoughts about a sort of guiding framework around how to think about the next phase. And it's okay to go to the next slide. Which is to say, just in terms of a guiding way to think about what comes next, is that we, as well as many other groups, have started wanting to lift up the argument that going back to normal really just kind of isn't good enough, because there's a range of structural inequities in our economy that sort of long predate the crisis. One is highlighted here that many, I'm sure, have heard about in terms of the increasing income concentration in our country over the past 50 years. The next one is perhaps not as widely known, but it's that wealth has also increasingly concentrated in this country, and perhaps especially concentrated, again, as the next slide will highlight, by race. As this chart is showing, households of color in the United States only own about 13% of the country's wealth, despite comprising about 40% of the population. Whereas the top 10% of white households in the darkest blue there own about 2/3 of wealth, of United States wealth. And so that is the kind of disparity that has been longstanding, but as the next slide will show, and I'm here, I know, almost at the end, that is both longstanding, and in this case, it was actually not necessarily even getting better when COVID-19 arrived. The data here is showing how household wealth in Black and Hispanic communities was actually still down, somewhat significantly down, I would argue, from the prior crash, from the Great Recession of the prior decade, whereas wealth was sort of back on the uptick for white families from that crisis when COVID arrived. Those sort of disparities, caused by past and present injustices, show up in a range of ways, such as by children in Black and brown communities being much more likely to grow up in very high poverty neighborhoods, which has a raft of sort of lifelong social and economic and workforce effects. And then on the next slide, I'll close out with perhaps a stat that's a little bit unlike all the others, but is from some research that I spearheaded recently and that we kind of dug into the weeds on, is that one of the things we see from these longstanding inequities in our country by income, race, as well as gender, is it causes us to miss out on the sort of full contributions that people in those communities who have been historically excluded would be able to sort of fully bring to bear in a nation that was more economically equitable, in terms of workforce opportunities, opportunities to be entrepreneurs, or in this case, to sort of bring their full ideas to bear and eventually become inventors. These data come from a study that's widely referred to as the Lost Einstein study that showed, for example, that due to these sorts of structural issues, boys are, for example, 4 times more likely to grow up to be inventors than girls. And there are also those disparities by race and ethnicity that I highlight here. I close with this to say that these are the sorts of opportunities on the table out there for an approach in a post-COVID economy, an approach to the workforce that really leans into advancing equity and access to opportunity and prosperity for all.